Hi, I'm Kurt Doolittle for the Proprietarian Institute of Natural Law. This is Group Strategy Part 2, Geography and Resources. I just want to tell the audience, I think I've done this like 10 times now, trying to get it right, so let's hopefully this time's a winner. So again, in the introduction, I covered that physical causes, behavioral demands, institutional demands, and the physical consequences, again, of our group strategy. In this section, we're going to cover what's in red, the geography and the resources. Now, geography is an interesting subject, and you'll find that most geostrategists hold the same approximate opinion as, tell me what your geography is, and I'll tell you everything about your civilization. Unfortunately, it's way more influential than we'd like because it produces so many opportunities and constraints. Over on the left side, you'll see movement. Well, I can move across the Tundra and Arctic, or the arid lands and the deserts, the jungle and forests and mountains, but these things require really foot traffic. They also are opposite in their resources. For example, the tundra, Arctic, or the arid deserts, they may be not only difficult to cross or deadly to cross, but they have limited resources. Whereas the jungle, the forests, and the mountains can have plentiful resources. They're just incredibly difficult to move through and cross. Now, the prairie, the plain, the steppe, and the savanna, you have a really long visible hunting horizon. They tend to be very good for finding large-scale herds to hunt. And if you get a horse or some animal that can carry you, you can cross large distances very easily and quickly, which is the reason for the Indo-European expansion. If you have navigable rivers, not only do you have irrigation, not only do you have the fact that rivers attract wildlife, they produce marshes, you can fish in them, so you have around navigable rivers, you have not only your water, but you have multiple kinds of food sources available to you. Not only that, you can use rafts or boats to transport yourself or goods up and down them, so trade is really easy and it's really cheap. Obviously today we ship these vast container ships with everything on them on the seas. But on the rivers, you can make a reed raft. I mean, there's a video about Noah's Ark by what's his name, Irving Finkel. He covers how they built these reed boats in history. They're basically round, and frankly, they still build them today. If you have that raft, you can carry pretty large rafts you can make, and you can carry lots of people and goods up and down the river at almost no cost. You can barge them. In other words, you can even tie in them to an animal and have the animal drag the thing. If you have access to the sea, not only do you have the ability to move great distances, moving around the edges of continents, but you can put incredible loads. I mean, by the age of sail, I mean hundreds of tons on a single ship. And if you're on a peninsula or island, not only do you have the access to the waterways, to the seas, probably rivers, but you also have an extraordinary defense. So islands are, Crete is one of probably the best climate on Earth, and is incredibly defensible if you can afford the navy to pay for it. Now, Britain is a small island on the edge of the Eurasian continent, and they conquered the world with a navy. So within these different territories, we also have different kinds of food, and we have different kinds of food produce different kinds of population density. Population density produces more opportunity for trade, division of labor and trade, so you can get more productivity out of it. You also can, of course, exhaust your resources. So again, with waterways, when you get into the agrarian era, you have irrigation and the opportunity to concentrate production. So you can transport the production up and down, and you can transport troops. This combination makes this high concentration of production along the irrigated rivers, the ability to transport quickly up and down them inexpensively, especially troops, and the ability to tax that high concentration with a relatively small number of troops, and the fact that if you're in irrigation, you can't move. In other words, you can't run away with this little bit of irrigated land, so you're captured. In other words, your capital can be captured by troops to tax. So this is how you get a city. You get the ability to produce taxes, which can fund a military, which can increase trade, which can be because it decreases local rents, local corruption, and it decreases raiding and crime and war. So you get these cities and they can afford specialists, which only creates multiples on top of the trade. You can have geographic isolation, in other words, parts of our world. Obviously, a peninsula or a island is geographically isolated, but we don't think of it as India. As India and China and Western Europe are relatively geographically isolated. Obviously, Australia is, and what we don't think of it, but Africa is highly geographically isolated. It's a thin strip of green down the middle and a little at the bottom there, and it's a desert above and highlands, almost unpopulated highlands below. So you really have this thin strip of green, and there aren't any rivers going across it. They go up and down on the east side, and they just loop on the west side, and so there's no way to get across this. So for all intents and purposes, West Africa is as far away as Australia. If you look at the Rift Valley in East Africa, of course they have the Nile to the north, the Rift Valley going south, and they have the Red Sea Strait to conduct trade, and you can see this by the population density map. If you're in China, you're still able to trade with the rest of the world, but all these tribes have a hard time getting to you. So it's quite defensible over there. Same thing for Europe. It was quite hard for the hostiles in the steppe to get all the way into Europe. They had to go through a lot of barriers to get there. So in the Middle East, you can get access to all the trade, technology, and information. Of course you can. The problem is it's very hard to form a stable political system there because precisely because you're at the intersection of all these continents and all these trade and all these hostiles. Whereas if you're in China, you can build your wall, and you've got to get through a desert and a mountain range and or very cold weather, and it takes a long time to get there. You might also have an issue of competitors. So if you're in an area where, like Europe or East Asia, where it's ethnically somewhat homogeneous, and you are practicing the same basic economic strategy, you have a lot fewer. In other words, there's not too much difference between your income, your levels of productivity or your income. Then there's less means for friction other than trade. Whereas if you're in the steppe or the desert and you're right next to the advanced river civilizations, obviously you can have fairly serious issues pop up, like the fact that there's a big difference between the people just in the mountains, just outside the Tigris-Euphrates, or just to the north of the Tigris-Euphrates, or just to the southeast. There's plenty of places for hostiles to come from, and so there always were hostiles coming. Whereas if you look at Egypt, it's got even better than the Tigris-Euphrates. On the other hand, it's basically a thin strip of green with nothing on either side of it, so it's really hard to cross a desert and get there. So you have a thin strip of easily capitalizable land, easily taxable, easily protectable land, and it's very hard for anybody to get to it to impose costs upon you. In the Indus River Valley, you have a worse problem, of course. They're surrounded by a huge number of opponents on all sides, and eventually they were just collapsed. And the later civilization, whose name is escaping me right now, that's been all but razed, that was on the steppe, that's gone too. However, if you're in Europe, Europe's a different problem. If you're in Europe, we don't have any flood rivers. Yeah, we've got lots of rivers. We've got this amazing green spot, but it's really hard to concentrate capital. So you end up with lots of small states, small governments, lots of tribes, and it's very hard to organize. It's impossible for the Romans. The Romans were really successful as marines. In other words, they used a combination of army and navy to transport around the Mediterranean. But that's different because you have this incredible speed. They built these roads the Roman roads for speed, but even such, you have to garrison troops everywhere in order to maintain order. I mean, the sea does a good job of maintaining order on its own. All right, have I covered this enough? So your competitors, it's not just that they're kin, it's that if they have different groups with different strategies because they're at different levels of development. And lastly, you have the dimension of disease. So movement, resources, waterways, geographic isolation or not, and the competitors and diseases. Africa in particular, the real reason this has to be here is Africa. Africa naturally has a lot of diseases, as we've seen recently and throughout history. An awful lot of diseases begin in the Yellow River Valley because there's this incredible mixture of all sorts of human and animal runoff, and it's a very long territory, and it has ideal conditions for cooking diseases. But Africa in particular, I mean, just the tsetse file alone makes it impossible to have horses. So you have all these incredibly difficult things that can happen, and one of them is just, Africa has an incredible disease gradient. Read Plagues and Peoples, which is a good book on it, and it's very difficult to overcome. So I'm going to break these geographies down into the Fertile Crescent Land, which is a network of very closely related early agrarian civilizations that were able to practice high-quality farming with flood rivers. Then the riverlands like in China, the rivered forest lands in Europe, the steppe lands like in Central Asia, the borderlands which are between civilizations that tend to be unsettled, and their ethic applies also to the landless people. For example, the Turkic people were from North China, and they were pressed out of that by a combination of dry weather and usual Chinese success and expansion, and they moved back into Mongolia where they converted to pastoralism, and they consistently expand so that the Turkic people are really a blend of Iranic and Asian peoples. You have desert lands like what emerged in the Middle East, although the Middle East was at one time quite beautiful, and you have, of course, hostile lands like Africa. Now, I've put a bunch of maps together because I want to talk a little bit, make sure we have a picture in our head of what the Earth is like. There's obviously, if you look at this terrain map in the upper left, you can see that there are a set of green spots. If you look at the lower left-hand quarter and look at the arable land, you see that these green spots are not always where they look like on the terrain. They look on the terrain map. If you look at the navigable rivers, you can see the few places where it's possible to develop transport and trade. You can look at the freshwater up there, which will help clarify, well, there's fresh water in these places, there's arable land in these places, so it's not just having the major rivers, it's having major rivers plus all the water sources that come into you. And the result is the population density map, which of course looks pretty much like the arable land quality map, where it's in its densest wherever the major rivers are. That's a relatively current look at the world. In our ancient history, but in other words, in prehistory, there were these incredible marshy wetlands. So in the upper left, you have the Doggerland, where the British Isles and lower Scandinavia and Germany and France, these were all connected, and it was a low marshy waterways where ideal for hunting and fishing, and that's why they're dragging up all these Neolithic tools from the North Sea all the time. You can see next to that in the middle of the top is the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Now, the Black Sea and Caspian used to be fresh water, purely fresh water, glacial runoff, and so we look at the Black Sea today without realizing that was a pretty ideal place to live for a good chunk of human history up until about 5,600 years ago. The same for the Caspian Sea. This was a nice place to live up there. And so when you see the migration paths for human expansion, you begin to see why there's this split north of the Black and Caspian with what's Europeans or West Eurasians and the southern peoples, which are South Eurasian peoples. The next one over is down into the Southeast Asia, where it used to be a perfect place for hunting. Lots of waterways, lots of marshes, a few highlands. In the bottom right corner, you see the dry Persian Gulf before the seas rose. You can get across from the Red Sea at this point, and once you get into what's today's Persian Gulf, you have some beautiful freshwater lakes and a lot of feeders into this lakes, and the area is green. Today it's all wasteland desert, but you can see how ideal this situation would be for humans to live in. In the center bottom and bottom left is a view of the East African Rift Valley, and this is where we were born, so to speak. There was another location farther south in Africa where it looks like spread happened also, but in most recent times, this beautiful area of the Rift Valley must have been an amazing place to live, and it still has lots of water and resources. Then we come into the river civilizations during the agrarian age, and these flood rivers are amazing. Of course, that's where you see these huge waterways. And I'm playing this up a lot because we tend to think of the world as political maps of the world, which don't really tell us much. Whereas if you look at water maps of the world and then humans live and work around water, begin to understand our history a little more clearly. This is interesting because I want to show a couple of things that Europe has so many waterways and so many navigable waterways that connect everything to everything, but even still, you can't concentrate it anywhere like you could in the other river valleys. Russia is an interesting case because Russia's 11 time zones. It's huge, but all the rivers run north-south, so there's no way to get across the damn thing. And this is, of course, there wasn't, until they put the railroad in, there was really no way of getting across there with any speed at all. So Russia's sort of screwed. Not only doesn't it have east-west waterways, it has only access to the Arctic, the Barents Sea and the Arctic Ocean, Pacific, the cold Pacific, and the Black Sea. So, Moscow, Moscow is the heart of Russia, is essentially a Baltic civilization without access to Baltic waters. So it was economically deprived of the ability to produce transport and trade. But on the other hand, because of that, the area was loosely populated. Of course, most of Siberia is a wasteland. They could easily conquer it because there weren't enough people there. So Russia made a push for territorial expansion that gave them access to extraordinary mineral wealth. And if you look at the lower right, you see how Russians view the world because of this. They view it from the top. So they think of the Arctic Ocean as the way we think of the Atlantic Ocean. And lastly, on the lower left, the American breadbasket. We can feed the whole world from here. So I always tell Americans that it's all well and good people talk about the cities, but in a world where the population is leveling out faster than we thought, except in Africa. But under these conditions, we can feed ourselves in the world, and we're also, with Canada, we're oil independent. So, we're pretty safe as long as we keep the population down. And lastly, I want to talk about the effects this had on trade. So in the upper left, there's just this nice record of Neolithic trade showing what primitive things are being shipped around the north of Europe. We see in the middle top the early agrarian trade. You can see Bronze Age amber trade in this little bit on the right-hand side. And you can see medieval Islamic trade, and you can see medieval European trade. The Turks capture Constantinople. They shut down the port to Europeans, and Europeans are now cut off from the overland trade route. So we develop the Age of Sail, explore, conquer, unite the world, and make the Silk Road and all its overland trade irrelevant, thereby driving Anatolia to west of China into poverty. In other words, the Middle East without taxes from trade, in other words, without sitting on this taxation thing, it's not a productive enough group, and they have never been able to form a political system. So we've just covered only two factors, geography and resources, and we've covered the territory of riverlands, forest lands, borderlands, steppe lands, desert lands, and hostile lands. Later on, we're going to cover the ethics of each of those places, but right now I just wanted to put our heads around how much geography matters and make sure that we understand the dimensions of geography that determine everything else that follows. That completes Geography and Resources. I'm Kurt Doolittle for the Proprietarian Institute of Natural Law. Hope you enjoyed it.